Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Firewalls Don't Stop Dragons. Today we have episode 407 for December 16th, 2024. And this is the first of two best of episodes that I'm going to be doing, which is something I've come to do in December. I like to take December off, take a little break. And so what I do is pre-record a few episodes. So today we've got what I'm calling the best of 2024. Because I pre-record this, it's actually kind of last December through this November. So I've got several snippets, and let me just say this was very hard to do. It was really hard for me to pick these. And while I would say that this is a wonderful sampler platter of the interviews that I've done in the last year or so, it's not really fair to call it the best of. I mean, that's the simplest way to call it. What I really tried to do here is pick some representative samples from the shows over the last year, some of my favorite interviews. But honestly, I like all the interviews, so it was really, really hard to pick these. And, you know, conversely, just because I didn't pick a snippet from a particular interview doesn't mean it wasn't one of my favorites. I really like doing the interviews. It wouldn't really make sense to do a best of episode with the news stories, though I suppose I could do a best of episode maybe of the tips of the week. Maybe I'll consider doing that in the future. But I will say that even being as picky as I was, and even editing some of the snippets down a little bit, this episode is going to be a little bit longer than usual. I try to keep it to a little over an hour, and mostly succeed. Today's going to be a little bit longer. But since they're all different kind of chunks, you can definitely consume this kind of piecemeal and maybe stop and start it. So I do a little setup for each of the clips to remind you what episode it was and who I was talking to. And I do have links to each of the original episodes, the original podcasts, if you want to go back and catch those in the show notes. And since this is a long one, I'm not going to spend much more time introducing it, but I will say one more thing, and that is, if you're a fan of the show, this episode would be a great one to share with others, because again, it's kind of like a little sampler platter. So share it with your friends and family. If you happen to share it on social media, you can tag me, and I will be sure to like and repost. So here we go. Let's get on with the best of 2024. Our first clip is from episode 362, which was on February 5th of 2024. And I was interviewing Patrick Wardle, a Mac security expert, and we talk about how to keep your Mac secure. All right, so what do you do when you get that fresh Mac and you take it out of the box in the beautiful Mac packaging and you fire that baby up the first time? What are the first things you do to harden your Mac? Or, you know, just kind of generally, what settings do you tweak, if anything, on a brand new Mac?
Yeah, this is a great question, too, because we just talked about getting hacked, and it turns out that there's some basic things you can do that really make you I would say more secure than the majority of the population. And hackers are super opportunistic. And so if you are more difficult to hack, they're just going to go on to the next. I'm all about analogies. And a great one here is like a thief coming into a neighborhood who's looking to steal, I don't know, jewelry, TVs, whatever thieves steal. If the first house has a barking watchdog, they're just going to go to the next house. If the next house has camera systems and alarm, they're going to skip that one and go to the third house. They're basically going to look for the easiest targets. Hackers, exactly the same. And so one of the first things I do is make sure that the operating system is fully updated. And this is probably the best thing you can do, because what happens is when Apple pushes out a patch or a new version of macOS, one, they patch all the security vulnerabilities that have been reported or have been discovered being exploited, but also they a lot of times add in additional baked-in security mechanisms. So for things like, you know, now we have notarization checks that didn't exist on older versions of macOS. On some recent versions of macOS 2, there's additional checks on the application. Every time it's run, it's checked to make sure that the code signing certificate is still valid. That's a new feature, a new security feature. So always run the latest version of macOS or iOS, and that alone ensures that you are way more of a difficult target to hack. And the majority of malware and hacks and intrusion attempts will fail just because of that. So that's the first thing I do.
So I assume the thing that goes along with that is to turn on automatic updates for everything.
Yeah, exactly. Especially for the operating system. You know, for third-party software, you know, it's probably a good idea, but, you know, I like to see what they fix and, you know, what features they've added. But yeah, for the operating system, it's almost a no-brainer. And some people are like, well, I want to hold off to make sure it doesn't crash my system. But Apple's done a pretty good job testing. And so I think the security cost outweighs anything else, and really just the best thing you can do. So turn on auto updates, make sure full disk encryption is enabled, which I believe it is now by default. Make sure the built-in firewall is installed. I like that. And then install some of your favorite third-party security tools. I think in this day and age, with the attention that macOS is getting from ransomware gangs, from nation-state adversaries, from opportunistic financially motivated hackers, really makes sense. So I install my own security tools.
Sure.
Block and Lulu are kind of my two go-to ones. But if you have a favorite antivirus product, that's a great idea as well. You do that, and then you combine that with using like a password manager and, securing your accounts with two-factor authentication, like you're good. Like almost certainly you won't be hacked. And, never say never, but you have just reduced the likelihood of that by such a large percentage. That should give you some peace, reduce some anxiety, and allow you to kind of just, use your computer to do fun things.
Next up, we've got episode 364. This is where I interview Jen Caltrider from Mozilla's Privacy Not Included group, which sadly has been shut down. It was a great group. They did great work. Jen in particular did wonderful studies there and published really interesting articles about how so many of our devices are just horrible when it comes to privacy. And one of their big stories that has since won lots of awards was about privacy in cars. And of course, I've talked with Andrea Miko before about privacy in cars, but Jen had a great perspective on this. And it was really, the whole interview was good, but here's a little snippet where we talk about privacy, but also how that can lead to security problems. Besides just, the creepy privacy stuff, there's real security aspects to this kind of data being collected. I mean, one of the things you mentioned was spouses or ex-lovers or somebody you were with, you shared a car together, you're with some time together, and they've maybe now have access through the car app or something to track you or to get some of this data to find out, oh, maybe she's cheating on me. Where's the new place she's been spending the night or things like that. There are security issues around this too. Do you know of any other, like either theoretically or true actual anecdotes where this has become an issue?
Well, it was interesting when we were doing our research, we would read as much about the cars and apps and stuff as we could. And you'd go to like some of the app pages and they would tout features like our valet parking features. And that would include things like location tracking, a geofencing. So you could set up a geofenced area and you would get a notification anytime your car left that geofenced area. Or teen driving protections features, which include being able to set limits on speed or how loud the radio can be or convenience features like a digital key that you can give to somebody to use temporarily and then revoke at any time. And as we were reading about these, they all sound, valet parking feature that lets me track things and get a notification when a car leaves an area, or digital keys that I can revoke at any time. And, I'm a jaded person, and all I could think of was how these could be used by abusers in horrible, horrible ways. But there was never any mention on any of the car manufacturers' literature about, hey, these features are designed to be useful for valet parking or your teen driver, but we recognize that these could be abused in abusive situations. And so if that's the case, here are some measures we've taken to help prevent that. I never saw that. And if anybody that's heard of AirTags, AirTags came out from Apple, the little tracking Bluetooth things. And not long after, people are like, these could be used by stalkers. We need anti-stalking features. And Apple said, we better get on that. And they did. And it's gotten a little better. And I feel like with the cars, it's like, again, it goes back to, was there just nobody in the rooms when they were building these things? Like, was there like literally no woman in the room that said, hey, this could be really abusive if somebody got a hold of this? Like, or did some woman in the room raise her hand and they just ignored her? Or did they just not think? I just don't know how you could build these features for location tracking, geofencing, remote keys, limiting area, limiting speed, and not think how they could be abused, and then not have any way to like acknowledge that this could be abused and say, here's how to contact us if you're having issues, or here's a way to disable things, or just anything to kind of mitigate that. And again, I don't know, is it car companies are stupid or are they evil? I can't tell, but it's really frightening to me that there's women out there that have been stalked by their abusers by their cars and haven't been able to get the companies to do anything about it. Like, we're Americans. Our cars mean something to us. They mean independence and freedom. And, they're where we have our first kiss, or the hanky-panky in the back seat, or we sing too loud, or we have a sensitive conversation with our kids. Like, people think of them too. I mean, to this day, I think they still think of them as a private space, an extension of their home. And the fact that they are so no longer private to the degree that they are, and people aren't really aware of it, because we don't buy cars every year or every couple of years like we do a phone or a computer or something like that. We buy cars every 5 years or 10 years, and privacy can't be the first thing we think about. You have to think about what you can afford and what's safe and what features fit your needs and what's available to you. And only after all that, maybe privacy might be a consideration, but after you've bought the car, it's too late to do anything. And even if there was anything you can do, which there's really not. And so it's just, we've gotten to the point where we're just in a really bad situation, and there's not a lot consumers can do. And it's up to the policymakers and the regulators to step up and push these car companies to be better, because there's just, at this point, we're kind of helpless, and that stinks. As a privacy researcher who advocates for consumers, it makes me really, really angry when consumers don't have any choice.
Next, we have a snippet from episode 366, where I talked to both Jason Kepler and Joseph Cox from 404 Media. Those guys are doing some amazing work. If you have not checked out their website, 404 Media, you should definitely do so and become a subscriber. They're doing some really good reporting over there. And I wanted to talk to those guys about data abuse, all the data we're collecting either for ourselves or companies, and how just the mere existence of that data is causing problems. So here we're talking about how, the old CCTV cameras in businesses and things are now being wired up together in the cloud and being used to track and view people in real time. Well, and so talking more about some of the cameras, another story that you guys came out with very recently that I had not heard of before was a company called, I get this, Fusus, Fusus.
That's how we've been pronouncing it, and I'm going to go with that because we mispronounce on the podcast all the time. So let's just go with Fusus. I like that. Yeah.
All right. Well, walk us through that. That's another very disturbing story. Walk us through what you found there.
Yeah, sure. So Fusus is a company that it turns dumb cameras into smart cameras. You can take ordinary CCTV cameras from a residence, be that a doorbell or something, or a business, that could be a 7-Eleven or whatever, or your town hall, your city hall, anything like that. And that's a normal CCTV camera, very boring, whatever. It just goes into, presumably, not a VHS anymore, but it goes into a room where a security guard is in City Hall.
Right.
What happens now is that Fusus, when they add this hardware onto the camera, it can put that all to a central repository, or what Fusus likes to call a single pane of glass, and law enforcement can look at those feeds and interact with them all the time as one. So that's sort of one half of it, is bringing it all together in one sort of central unit. And then the other part is what I mentioned, turning it into a smart camera, which is adding this AI capability. So that could be object recognition, such as, person carrying red bag or something. People recognition, which is not facial recognition. They're very, very strong, and we don't do facial recognition. But we can identify there's a guy with a red beanie and XYZ characteristic or something. So it's still identifying people. And then there's vehicles as well with automatic license plate reading, LLPR. So you have all those capabilities. And then bringing them together, I think it completely changes what it means to have security cameras in a town or a city or whatever, because we're so used to, well, there was a crime outside 7-Eleven and now the cops will go to that location, they'll ask the security guys for the footage, then they do it retroactively. They get to do almost like proactive investigations now. They get direct access, is the actual words that Fusus uses, so they can do this in real time. Now look, there's a complete other discussion about whether that's effective policing or not, and law enforcement say it's very effective, at least the ones that we've heard talk. But there's also discussions about proportionality, and especially how long is that data retained, where exactly is it going, what are the security policies on that data, all of that sort of thing. This is a purely hypothetical example that I'm just coming up now off the top of my head, but because I mentioned data policies, it's like, when it was before, when it was a dumb camera just going to one location, you couldn't have a cop or anybody else like just peer through the camera and just maybe follow somebody across town. When it's all in one location, they can switch between cameras. They can now do that. That's literally a new capability, which has sort of come out of nowhere just by linking all the cameras together. And, you know, it's not my place really to say whether this is sort of good or bad. It's a very simplistic way of putting it, but also I'm not a cop, so, you know, I'll let the cops talk for themselves. I'm also not a resident who's had to deal with this, so I'll let them deal with it as well. But what we did was, the first article was we did a bunch of public records requests to agencies all over the US, got tons of records back, did a story about that, just showing the spread. And then the more recent story we did is that we actually got a real sense of the scale. And there was a security researcher who also described themselves as a hacktivist, and they found Fusis's public-facing API. They managed to scrape at least a lot of that, maybe not all of it, but a lot of it. And they found that there are at least hundreds of these police departments across the US with nearly 200,000 integrated cameras. Integrated are the ones specifically with the sort of hardware add-on. There's also a lot more registered cameras, which is still interesting, but it's more, you know, you're a resident and you just tell the police, hey, I have a camera. If there is a crime, you can come request it from me. That's almost closer to Ring in some ways. Right. But yeah, we now have a real sense that Fusus is spreading across the US. And again, I just think there should be a conversation over whether people want that or not. You know, it really is that simple.
Yeah, I have something very brief to say, hopefully brief. But Fusus does integrate privately owned cameras that residents have or can. And Ring also does that, where these are homeowners or business owners sort of voluntarily saying to the cops, you can come to me for footage if you need it. I think that there's like a connected conversation to be had that is like pretty political, but you know, I've written a lot about sites like Nextdoor, which are neighborhood specific social media. You know, Ring has a similar one called Neighbors. Right. And if you go on there are many homeowners who are posting footage from their cameras, and they have kind of scared each other into thinking that their neighborhoods are very dangerous places. Right. When, you know, even now, like there was an uptick in crime during the pandemic, but crime is at very low rates historically. But what has happened is you have these people who are sort of like voluntarily, because they believe that they live in very unsafe places, they're voluntarily going to the police and saying, you can use my camera anytime you want, for any reason that you want. And, you know, there's not a reasonable expectation of privacy, legally speaking. It's like you're allowed, if your camera's attached to your home, you're allowed to broadcast that footage. But we're moving towards a place where cops are going to be able to see any place in the country at any moment in time, just because people are voluntarily giving them this information. And I think that that's a different dynamic than has existed ever. Right. And I personally find it very concerning. Other people, the people who are volunteering to do this, seemingly want to live in that world. But I don't know. I walk my dog and I walk past tons of Ring cameras, and I'm like, I don't like it. I'm not doing anything wrong, but I don't like that I'm being filmed all the time.
Yeah. So I think that what we need to realize is that when we have these old CCTV cameras, like you said, they went to a VHS tape on a loop that maybe kept 2 hours worth of data or a week's worth of data, and then it was gone, and you had to go get it. But this, you know, the difference in scale, and we went from this decentralized network to these centralized networks, and that has a whole different qualitative feel to it. And for one thing, I just recently read a story about how Russia had hacked into some of these publicly available webcams in Ukraine to help target missiles, right? Because there's a camera across the street from the power facility that you want to shoot. Hey, hack into that camera, turn it over there and fire. Oh, nope, little bit to the left. you know, try it again.
Yeah.
And we've got to be thinking about these things. And so I'm curious to know, surely our intelligence agencies and law enforcement must realize that this cuts both ways, all this data collection. Just because the quote unquote good guys can get it, the bad guys can get this stuff too. They must realize this. So do they then think, is the calculus that, well, it does us more good than it does harm?
Well, there was a company called Verkada, still exists, but it's similar, like smart cameras, possibly facial recognition, but definitely like object recognition, connected, whole deal. And it's like they had a security incident a few years ago where all of this, like tons and tons and tons of gigabytes of data were just like available. And it was footage of people's offices. It was footage of prisons. It was footage of all sorts of things. And it's like, this is not a theoretical concern. It's like when you record everything, it can easily become public, whether you want it to or not. It's hard to keep all this stuff, secure. And so it can cut both ways. I think the calculus definitely doesn't have that built into the threat model necessarily. I think that, the cops are thinking that they're going to get more utility out of it than any potential, nation state using it. I don't even know if they're thinking about that sort of thing at this point. I don't know if they're sophisticated enough to think in that way. The way that a lot of this stuff gets sold is at like law enforcement conferences where you go with all your cop buddies to a conference and like watch amazing technology occur and then go back and have your city council appropriate funds and purchase it. I don't think that, like, we've seen that how these sorts of things get bought, and it's usually like one or two evangelist cops who went to a security conference somewhere and was like, wow, this is crazy. My friend at the other police department 2 counties over said that it helped them solve a crime, like we should buy it too. And then the next thing you know, there's like $1 million contract in that new town. So I don't know. I don't think they're thinking about how it can cut both ways. That's my read on it.
All right. Next up, we jump to episode 376, which was May 13th. And I had a great interview with Dina Temple-Raston from NPR and the Click Here podcast. And we talked about Ukraine's IT army and the hybrid warfare going on there. And so we focused on the cybersecurity part of that and what we can and should be learning from what's going on there. What should we be learning from what is happening in Ukraine right now? Let's take this in 2 parts. Let's look at the as citizens and consumers separately, but let's start with the government. What is the U.S. government learning from what we're seeing here? I know that this is kind of, I hate to say silver lining or anything, but we do get the opportunity here to see how our adversaries operate, both on the cyber field and on the war field, and how they respond to, like, I know we're providing weapons, for example, and we get to see how our weapon systems work against them. I would assume the same thing is kind of working in the cyber area as well. What are we passively learning from what we see going on between them? And have we taken what we've already learned in the last couple of years and applied that locally to improve our own defenses? Do we know anything along those lines?
I can do the first part of that, which is people at DOD, who are sources of mine that I've talked to, or in the cyber realm, said that what Ukraine really did is a lot of things were theoretical, right? And and what this person told me was, it's really different sort of thinking through how something might be in a war as opposed to actually being in a war and doing it. Yeah. And this person said that there were lots of disconnects that she wasn't expecting between what they thought would happen and what actually happened. So there are all kinds of lessons there. This person wasn't particularly specific, but you can imagine, right? I think the other thing is that there was a general sense that the Russians were 10 feet tall. And it turns out, not that there's anything wrong with this height, because that's my height, they're 5'4", right? Yeah. They're fierce and fiery, but they're not 10 feet tall. And so I think that brought a lot of realization. And then there's this other thing that people don't talk about, which is the brain drain in Russia. And that is the people who could leave, the people who had skills, and many of these people would have been computer people who don't necessarily have to speak perfect English, but have the cyber skills that they could do remotely. These people left by the tens of thousands. They left. So the Russian bench is pretty thin because the people who were really good at this, most of them left. Even before the war, Russia was becoming more and more authoritarian, right? Sure. So think about what makes a great hacker. What makes a great hacker is imagination, right? Thinking out of the box, thinking laterally. what makes a political dissident in Russia? Someone who thinks out of the box and thinks laterally, right? So it isn't a system. The Ukrainians told me this. It isn't really a system in which you would expect creative people to stay, because creative people can't stay in that kind of environment in which is so repressive, in which you can't talk, in which you have to be careful about everything that comes out of your mouth, in which you can't put up a poster, in which you can't tweet or post, I guess now that it's X, or that you can't, or that you have to be careful about what you say in a cafe because someone might tell the authorities, right? So when you think about it just in terms of human sense, I think that was another one of the really big lessons that came about, was that a lot of their hackers left. And the Ukrainians said, and we couldn't really confirm this, but the Ukrainians said one of the things that the Russians are starting to do is, because they realize that they have a thin hacker bench, is they're starting to do with hackers what they did with young athletes during the Soviet times, which is they're finding people who are good at math, maybe mechanically inclined, maybe catch on to things really quickly, and they're streaming them into courses that would have them build robots or start to do cyber coding and that sort of thing. So they're kind of creating little cyber athletes so that they have a generation of people who are very good at this. Now, the Israelis have already done this, right? So they have I did a story for NPR about this. They have a program called Magshimim, which is almost like a AP cyber program here in the United States. So you find people who are good at this, you stream them into particular sort of classes. And one of the things they really teach them is that, you know, if you have these cyber skills, you're special, and therefore you should be using them for the good of Israel. You shouldn't be using them to, say, hack into other places. And a lot of the people who end up streaming into the Magshimim program end up in Unit 8200, which is basically their NSA. And since there's required military service, instead of having to carry a gun in Gaza, although they might well be carrying a gun in Gaza right now, but as a general matter, instead of having to carry a gun and be on the front lines, they think that your contribution to the country is what you know about the cyber realm. So you do your military service in Unit 8200. All the big Israeli cyber companies that you hear about now are people who did their service in 8200 and then went on to build their own businesses.
So as consumers and citizens, is there anything we should be taking away from what we're seeing there and maybe helping protect ourselves and protect others?
Well, there was an example of this just recently. There's a Chinese hacking group called Volt Typhoon, and it's a state hacking group. And they basically dropped a lot of malware in various critical infrastructure in the United States. And one of the ways that they got in was using routers. So the router that you never think about, it's interesting because there are two different ways to get routers, right? You can get them from your telecom company in the bundle with your cable and your telephone. I still have a landline, dates me. And I have a mobile too. But basically you can get them as a package, right? So you typically don't think very much about routers. But, you know, at your small business somewhere, you want to have Wi-Fi for you and your small group of employees. So you have a router, right? And that router you bought, I don't know, 15 years ago. And you didn't think about it. It's in the corner somewhere. It's got little dust balls around it. You know, the antennas are bent, but it works. So you don't really think about it. But this is exactly the way that adversaries can get into a network, right? So they just monkey bar over from one router to something else that's connected. And before you know it, they're inside. So it really has to do with sort of common sense, right? In the same way that I know there are some places that don't lock their doors, but as a general matter, you close the door and you lock it.
Yeah.
And in the same way, you should see your whole cyber hygiene and the way you work with cyber in the same way. You know, if a message comes that seems a little weird, don't click on it. And it sounds crazy, but you know, I'm much more. We've been now doing Click Here for a while, and we probably have some hacker adversaries that don't love us. So we are super focused on everything that comes in. We have all kinds of firewalls in. We have things that make it sticky. And within the Recorded Future News company, if we get something, we have a Slack channel where we said, we got this. Is this really from you? Mm-hmm. So it comes with being just a little bit more aware that this is a new attack surface and that you can't blithely not think about it. You actually have to think about it in the same way you do when you lock your car or when you lock your house. You need to lock down these things that are facing to the internet because all they have to do is scan, right? I mean, they don't even have to pick you. Right. There are actually programs you can buy for $25 that will literally $25 on the dark web that will scan and look for things. That's how the cyber avengers got into these water treatment plants. So that's what I would say Click Here is not for techie people. It's actually for regular people, and techies listen to us too. And I would say the big lesson we've taken away from all of this is that there's a lot of low-hanging fruit, and we could take care of a lot of these attacks that we're seeing in city halls or schools or everything else by just doing those simple things.
At the end of May, I had a chance to interview Naomi Brockwell, who's doing some really great work. And we were talking about what kind of things we can be doing to help normalize privacy. And she had a great answer. This is from episode 378. Short of regulations, because we kind of go to that a lot, are there any other things that we could be doing to rein in some of this horrible data hoovering by the corporations?
Yeah, and so there are lots of things we can do. We already chatted about just voting with your money and choosing products that are better because you help the entire ecosystem. Not only do you help the investment in privacy products for the future, but you also create a larger anonymity set for those who do need the privacy, right? So if I'm the only person using Signal and I'm really trying to hide myself as a matter of life and death, if someone wants to know who that person using Signal is, they know it's me because I'm the only one using it, right? If everyone is using Signal, that's a much larger pool for someone who needs the privacy to hide in. So you're also helping just by adding to that anonymity set. On top of that, you mentioned if you're in a position to do so, maybe you can start to change corporate culture. Maybe you can start to normalize privacy in a way that pushes back against some data collection practices people take for granted. If they're like, oh, well, we may as well just collect this information. You can make them aware that any information they collect is a liability. It may have a potential benefit, but there is also a potential cost. And the cost is not just to the company in terms of liability. And yes, there are increased lawsuits against companies that don't protect privacy and security of customer data, and it ends up on data breaches. But also there is a cost in terms of us changing the fabric of society. Do we want to keep feeding this complacency with just being able to harvest everyone's private information? Or do we want to just start to push back against that and normalize respecting people's privacy? If you're in charge of writing the privacy policy, are you writing it just as liability insurance for the company, or are you actually disclosing to the end user information that may make them choose not to use your product? Try to, if you have any authority, say, let's err on the side of honesty. Let's call a spade. Let's give consumers information, treat them with respect, and let them make up their own mind. If we tell them we are going to be selling this data and we actually can't give you any guarantees of where it ends up, and this could be dangerous for you, give them that information and let them make their own mind. Because right now you're sugarcoating it and pretending that you have more assurances than you do. And I think it's an egregious misrepresentation of the facts that it should be shameful. And that's the other thing. The final thing I'd say is that when companies do things that are shameful, hold them accountable and start asking questions. And when you swipe your card at a point of sale system, do you ever ask them, what's the privacy policy on this? Because they probably don't know, but the manager probably doesn't know either. But when that manager goes to renew the contract, if enough people have asked about the privacy policy, maybe he'll actually ask the, point of sale system about their privacy policy before renewing that contract. If you're going to buy a car, actually ask the salesperson, what is the privacy policy on this? Who's collecting my data? How do I opt out? Because then it encourages them to find out more information about this, and they in turn can maybe help more people. If you're apartment hunting, have you ever bothered to look at the privacy policy of the apartment complex and what kind of data they're collecting about people coming and going from your apartment? Digital devices connected to the internet, information. These days apartments demand that you give over federal ID if you're even doing a tour of an apartment, right? Have you ever asked them what happens to that card once they scan it? Who gets access to it? How long do they retain it in their system? If we can just start asking questions about this, it really gets the conversation going, and we can become a society of informed citizens rather than naive people with their head in the sand who are just going along with it because no one bothered to question that data collection might be harmful. So if we just start to change culture, I think that's one of the most important things we can do, just by making these better choices, but also asking these questions and normalizing these questions. Right now, it's only kind of the people like you who are running podcasts like yours that are trailblazing this issue and getting these conversations started. But if we can get everyone to be asking these questions, that's a cultural shift that I think is for the better. It's like when you see a persecuted group and the first person who kind of asks, like, hey, should we be persecuting them? It takes someone to stick their head out of the sand and just and so I think that's something that we can all do, and we don't have to be hostile. We don't have to be assholes about it, right? We can literally just be okay if they don't have the answers, because honestly, no one's going to have the answers. It's just starting the conversation that's important. Just start asking the questions. Just start being a little more vocal about what your preferences and values are, because that creates the groundswell movement. Honestly, people do like to fit in, and if we can make privacy the new normal, that's an amazing improvement in society. So you guys, everyone can be that new normal just by, actioning these points and create that normal, and soon everyone is going to want to blend in. They're going to want to be like, I want to ask those questions because that's the thing that we do as a good society. It's unfortunate that people really like to follow others, but honestly, you guys, like everyone is in a position to be a leader in this. So if you value this, be that leader and blaze that trail, and let's shift the culture.
Over the summer, I managed to interview two great authors. One was Joseph Cox, who wrote an amazing book called Darkwire. If you have not read it, it reads just like a thriller, but it's real. It's an amazing story about the Anom phone, which is basically an FBI-created device that was used by the criminal underworld and led to a massive worldwide bust. It's an amazing story, and I was really glad to get a chance to talk to Joseph about it. So here's a little snippet from episode 380 from June 10th. What lessons do you think the FBI and other law enforcement took away from Operation Trojan Shield? What were their key takeaways? And for example, I know you went to a conference, I think it was Vancouver, where some of these FBI agents were giving a talk it was like a conference for law enforcement, I think. So what were they preaching? What were they saying were their takeaways from this? What did they learn?
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't supposed to be in that conference, obviously, but I did find a way in. I'm not a member of law enforcement, but I got in, and yes, towards the end of the talk, one of the FBI agents said they're very excited for the next iteration of Operation Trojan Shield, whatever that might be. Now, we don't know what that is. I'm sure the FBI is doing something, but all I would stress is that, first of all, the FBI learned, and its partners learned, that this works. It really, really works if they can somehow get access to an entire platform. So why would they not try that again? Second of all, I've been speaking to people, of course, who continue to sell these phones, and people who traffic drugs, and they continue to use encryption technologies. And while some are using encrypted phones from other providers, which still exist, but they're not at the same scale of Sky or anything like that, some are moving to just using a Graphene OS phone, putting Signal on it, doing their crimes, getting rid of the device, and then getting another one. And that brings up, I think, a very key and frankly urgent question, which is like, well, what is the FBI going to do when the criminals do move over to more consumer platforms? The FBI isn't going to pull up its hands and go, oh, damn, okay, well, they got away. I guess we can't do anything. They're going to find another investigative technique. And again, maybe that's hacking, or maybe it is trying to target a platform. And there is absolutely no evidence that Signal or another of these platforms has been done in that sort of way. But it absolutely raises the question of whether it could be, because the FBI has seen how successful this was. They've shown that it's possible. So, why would they not try to repeat it?
And right after I interviewed Joseph Cox from 404 Media about his book Darkwire, I turned right around and interviewed Byron Tao, the author of the book Means of Control. Another fantastic book about how all of this data collection by corporations, ostensibly for the purposes of marketing, is fodder for law enforcement and intelligence services, and not necessarily just your own, and not necessarily just the good guys, and puts us all at risk. So here's a little bit of my interview with Byron Tao, episode 382 from June 24th. Well, I think, to me, one of the most telling aspects to this, and you talk about this in the book as well, is despite having these legal justifications, and when you press them on this, they say the things that you say they say about what authorizes them to do this. But nevertheless, they actually often go to great lengths to hide these exact activities, and probably understanding that the general public, wouldn't like it. So what are some of the lengths that these organizations have gone to try to avoid scrutiny by the general public, and even, I think, congressional oversight?
Yeah, so a lot of the time they hide these programs under contractors, which makes it more difficult to get a sense of what the government is doing, because all they're doing is buying what they call a solution from a contractor, or they're buying a tool, a license. And so you have less visibility into exactly what the government is doing because it's a private party that's providing the service or that's providing the tool. So that's one way. The second way is simply not talking about it. In doing this reporting, I contacted almost every major federal government agency and a lot of state ones, and I got zero cooperation whatsoever. I filled out a nice long, 5-page application for, support from the Department of Defense and assistance in writing a book, which they made me do. And then it went right in the circular file, or at the very least, they never got back to me, despite me following up dozens of times to hear from their privacy officers and their contracting officers and their leadership about how they're working with this data and what safeguards they put on it. So, and the same thing was true of almost every government agency I wrote about. I had to rely on former officials, sometimes the occasional person who is currently inside. I had to rely on FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act, and a lot of contracting records. I had to rely on employees of the outside contractors to tell this story, because to the government, this is a useful capability. It's not necessarily classified. Most of what I write about in this book is technically unclassified. But to them, if the public knew how much data they were acquiring, if adversaries knew what exactly governments were doing with all this commercial data that was sloshing around, that they would change their behavior. And that even some corporations might find it uncomfortable to be selling this kind of data to the government. And, you also had companies that I would report on. There's one company in particular, Gravy Analytics. It's a marketing firm in the DC area. It started up and started collecting and aggregating a lot of location data. Well, at one point, they decided to start a federal contracting business. And, instead of doing that business under their traditional brand name, they set up this whole other subsidiary with a whole different trademark, and there was no outward links to them, because to some extent, they must know, that this is somewhat sensitive and that it wouldn't do their consumer-facing brand much good if they were known to be contracting directly with the Department of Homeland Security.
Well, there's even some more creepy versions of that. And for example, national security letters where they can actually require or demand assistance from some of these companies and then say, oh, and you can't tell anybody. But even worse than that, I think, so national security letters, they supposedly are doing that because it's, highly classified, or we can't let this get out. Okay. But in so many other cases, like with stingrays and some of these other technologies that they've used to gather data, they went to great lengths to make sure that, like, when cases were brought up when cases were brought up as the result of information that was found from these techniques, that they said, you can't actually use this in trial because we don't want anybody to know that we're doing this, right? I mean, they've actually made sure, they said, in fact, in some cases, they said, if the only way you can bring this to trial is to expose this data collection we're doing, then just skip it.
Yeah, a lot of these vendors put provisions in their contracts that the tool's output, the data that it generates, can never be introduced in a court proceeding. And I think the Harris Company, which manufactures the Stingray, and other tech companies that manufacture similar devices have put that in a lot of their contracts with police departments. And that also happened with location data companies. That there was one company called Babel Street, which said simply, you cannot introduce any of our material into court proceedings. Well, the problem with that is then the defendant is deprived of their right to challenge the technique. Right. And in some cases, many of these defendants never knew that they were subject to this kind of surveillance. So judges aren't even getting to weigh in on these sort of thorny privacy, civil liberties questions, even if they might ultimately come down on the side of these vendors and this kind of data collection. They're not even getting a chance to weigh in on this because defendants simply aren't being told that these tools and these techniques and these technologies are being used. And this is a pattern I've seen time and time again in reporting on this world, especially when these technologies move into the realm of law enforcement, that these vendors simply do not want the technology discussed, and the police are only happy to oblige because, as I was saying, people would change their behavior or they would, ditch their technology if they knew exactly how much surveillance they were subject to at any given moment.
So this next clip is a perfect counterpoint to the previous one, and honestly, a lot of the other interviews I've done. I talked to Jason Edison from Intel Techniques, and he is an OSINT, or open source intelligence expert, and he is in a very interesting position of playing both sides of the field. By day, he works in law enforcement, helping them catch bad guys, using open source intelligence, among other things. But at Intel Techniques, he works to help keep people's data hidden and try to, in some cases, kind of take people off the grid. His partner, Michael Bazell, wrote the book Extreme Privacy, and these guys have worked together for years on this kind of stuff. So it was a very interesting counterpoint to Byron Tao's book, and honestly, a lot of the other interviews I've done. I would actually love to interview more people who have worked in law enforcement or in the intelligence community. You can't really interview them usually when they're in the job, and actually even a lot of times when they leave the job, they're still restricted on what they can say. So that does make it harder. Nevertheless, I would love to talk to more people and get the other side of this argument. But anyway, here is a snippet of my interview with Jason Edison, which was episode 386 on July 22nd. You're one of the unique people I would have to think that have seen both sides of this and understand the harms that can come from it. What about other people you've worked with, and what's the culture like on the inside for that point of view?
Yeah, so I mean, things have really changed over the last 15 years. So when I first started in intelligence, I mean, it pretty much was the Wild West, right? Like nobody privatized anything. Everything was out there. So especially on the open source intelligence side, it was just kind of like everything was freely available. There has been quite a bit of progression along privacy lines and security lines as far as data collection and the use of that. So what I find now is we're in this kind of strange place where a lot of the agencies, at least on the public side across the country, are in really disparate parts of the spectrum. So for example, the agency that I work at, I can't use any of these services. We're just not allowed to. It's against policy. We have an ordinance in our city. We have a high level of scrutiny around anything that involves data sharing, data collection, all of those things. The upside is that's a good level of control so that we don't start just doing whatever we want. The downside is sometimes these things can be overreaching these policies. So we're using super outdated technology, which can have a security cost, right? And an effectiveness cost. So for us on the inside, it's this constant balance of we have to retain enough capability to protect people, but at the same time, we need to maintain or gain back public trust. And depending on what part of the country you live in, people's level of care on that is different. The politicians drive all of this. And I think that's a lot of times what people forget is, like, I work for a very large police department. There's very few decisions I make during my day that isn't dictated by a chain of command, right? So a lot of what is assigned to us as tasks, a lot of the tools we get are actually decided at a very high level. So as far as what people in the community can do is you have to let your elected officials know that maybe you don't like the idea of license plate readers. Maybe you don't like the idea. And basically at a community level, you need to make your voices heard. And I mean, my feeling is, working in the police department, if people don't want us to have a tool and that limits our effectiveness, that is their choice, right? And everything should just be transparent. I think my perspective is a little skewed because I work in one of the more restrictive agencies in the country. But I do travel around, and I will tell you there is more and more attention being paid to the privacy implications of these things. But it is going to vary from community to community, and my guess is a lot of that is based in the politics of different communities. And then at the national level, everything is much more murky. But I will just say, I was at the FBI for 7 years. The people there spend a lot of time checking, dotting their I's, crossing their T's, asking for permission. They're a lot more worried about violating a rule or a policy or doing something inappropriate than they are at getting the new fancy shiny tool. And I know that probably isn't going to match up with people's perspectives. I'm just telling you that was my experience there, is everything was very slow, bureaucratic, and cautious. So when I hear those stories, I'm not saying that none of that stuff ever happens that people see on the internet, but that has not been my experience from the inside. So again, I love my privacy. I'm not so worried about the government. I'm just worried about collection across the board. And then I'm worried about how cyber criminals are going to use that, because statistically what's going to happen to me is identity theft, getting my accounts taken over, extortion, harassment. Like that is what is, ruining people's lives day to day. That is what I'm concerned about for my kids. So I try and strike that balance because I do have that perspective from both sides. There should be accountability for any sort of government surveillance. And then what I keep saying too is we need to constantly make the conversation around appropriate use. I will also say, like on the electronic surveillance side, there's almost nothing I can do to get your private data that I don't need a judge to approve, right? And again, that might be a little different at the federal level, but if I want to, collect any of your actual private data, or if I want to hide a hidden microphone or do all those things, I'm going to need to get an approval from a judge. So a lot of the things people think that we can do willy-nilly are actually already protected by a level of authority or court approval, at least in the U.S. I know it varies vastly around the world. Right. I think people would be surprised about how restricted we are because that's not the narrative on the internet.
All right, so let me dig a little deeper on that and push back a little bit. What I'm hearing is, and I want to understand where this is coming from, is this because folks in law enforcement are trained to be rule followers, and therefore they follow the rules that are there and look to their leaders to help them interpret those rules and go by, because this happens a lot in law enforcement from what I've read. Someone says, hey, can we do this? And it goes up the chain and some lawyer signs off of it, and then like, oh, lawyer signed off. We're good. Let's do this. And I think to some extent, this is kind of what Snowden exposed is they figured out some kind of creative ways to follow the rules, and I'm doing air quotes that you can't see, but really broke the spirit of those rules. What is your take on that? Is it the most people want to make sure that they're finding stuff that's going to stand up in court, that's going to be admissible so they can get the bad guys, and they want to make sure that some lawyer somewhere signed off on the policy? Or are there really people in law enforcement who say, you know what, this might be legal, but it's not right, this seems shady? So what's your take?
Yeah, so we actually have these conversations quite a bit. And to clarify, because of my role in my agency is a little bit more of a lead role, right? Because I've been doing it for a long time. So I am part of a lot of these conversations with commanders, city leaders about surveillance, right? We have a lot of discussions about this. And I will say I've definitely witnessed kind of what you're talking about, which is I'll give you an imaginary example that reflects similar situations that I've seen in real life. So we have our child exploitation unit, right? And there is no unit in law enforcement that we can, more so get universally behind, right?
Yeah.
And
Right.
so I'm using that as an example because that is the example where everybody in the community online, everyone agrees, like, yeah, we need to catch these predators type of deal. One of the dangers of doing that kind of work is, one, the detectives get burned out so quickly because they have to see such horrible things. But two, you always have to be careful anytime you have an emotional investment. Now, every time I meet a victim, I have some level of emotional investment, right? Because they've been, raped, stabbed, robbed, all these horrible things. But there's no level of empathy that's going to be deeper than, when a child's harmed. And so what you can see in those cases sometimes is detectives or officers, I don't often see them color outside the lines, but I could see them, like you said, like, technically we can do this thing, and if we're ever going to do it, shouldn't we do it to protect this child? Like that type. That's and I think that's where people would start to be like, oh, that can be a slippery slope. Now, in my organization, we have so many checks and balances. So anytime anything is on the fence, it gets kicked up to us and those of us who have been doing this longer. And just as my offensive experience helps my privacy perspective, vice versa, right? So I'm usually the person in our agency who is bringing up the privacy concern. And we have those conversations about, yes, technically we can do this, but should we do it? Yeah. And when people come into my squad and we train them up, that's one of the first things I try and teach them is the first question should not be, how can I do this? The first question should be, should I do this? Now, I'm not going to say that is something universal through law enforcement that people are doing, but it is something we're trying to promote. And just like everything else, right, cultures are slow to change. But I will say most groups I've worked with naturally seem very professional, very responsible. But we always will have a bad apple here, a bad apple there, or everyone who's listening to this has worked with people, right? And in any organization, you're going to have some people who are bad at their job, right? Like there's no getting around it. So I do occasionally find myself cleaning up messes where someone got a technology they shouldn't have been able to get, or someone colored outside the lines. And my feeling on that is we just have to own it, right? Here's what happened. Yes, this was a big mess up, and yes, there needs to be accountability. We own it, have the conversation, learn from it, and move on. So it is definitely an issue, but I think overall my feeling is we're going in a good direction. We definitely have much more accountability and constraints than we had 10 years ago.
All right, next up, I have one of my most often interviewed guests. Andy Yen, the CEO of Proton, has been on my show at least 5 times. I'd have to go back and see exactly how many. But he's a very interesting person to talk to. One of the things I think is most interesting about Andy is that while he is obviously a huge privacy advocate, and Proton's line of products, including email, now calendar, VPN, even a wallet, a digital wallet, they've also been adding AI features, which AI tends to be pretty bad for privacy because a lot of the processing is done off board in the cloud. And so you're, giving information to third parties. But he had a very interesting response when I asked him about this, and it shows his very practical approach to privacy and what kind of products they put out. And you can disagree with his choices, but I think it's just very interesting to hear his reasoning. And real quick, he talked about Sir Tim, and Tim Berners-Lee is considered by most to be the father of the modern World Wide Web. So here's a snippet from my September 2nd interview, episode 392. All right, so you say that a lot of this is community-driven. I know that's true, but some of the other products you released, I'll be curious to know if your users were clamoring for these. Like, for example, Proton Scribe. That one really surprised me because, for one thing, AI is just a mess when it comes to privacy. Yeah. So much of the processing is done in the cloud, and that just immediately brings up and raises all sorts of privacy issues. So what drove you to add that particular functionality, and how do you do your AI processing without compromising privacy?
Well, a lot of people think about Proton community as sort of, all the folks on Reddit, all the folks on, Twitter, X, and actually that is a big part of the community and a very important part of the community, right? But what I think many folks don't realize is there are over 50,000 companies and enterprises including some that are, quite large international organizations who are also customers of, Proton. We still derive the vast majority of our revenue from the consumer business, and we are always a consumer business at heart. At the end of the day, I think it's a company culture thing, right? And I think the heart and soul of Proton is always for the consumers. But we can't ignore the fact that the community today also includes 50,000 businesses. And businesses, even the ones that are concerned about privacy and security, they're adopting AI. They're adopting AI because what matters to them is productivity. And I think even for privacy-focused consumers, it's something we need to consider and think about. Because if we look at the history of the web over the past 30 years, there have probably been 5 or 6 different, what I call, fork in the road moments where society had to make a choice between privacy on one hand and productivity. And I can tell you from history, at every single one of those forks, productivity has won, right? And so my perspective on this is we are, again, facing another fork in the road, between privacy and productivity. And if we force, whether it's businesses or individual consumers, to make a choice between the two of them, privacy is going to lose. So from that perspective, AI is a little bit inevitable. And my view then becomes, if AI is inevitable, then the challenge is not, how do I avoid AI? The challenge becomes, how to do AI in a privacy-first way? Because it's coming. And you can actually, it's interesting because, we actually have a Sir Tim on Proton's board, right? On the board of our foundation. And Sir Tim invented kind of the web, right? If you go back to the web is actually bad for privacy, right? The web created all sorts of things that, weren't possible back, before the web, right? So the web, bad for privacy for sure, but inevitable. And AI might be sort of the same. So with Scribe, what we wanted to do was, AI today is monopolized by, there's obviously Google and Microsoft, there's OpenAI, which is basically Microsoft in disguise, right? There's Meta getting involved. Apple's not there, but I guess they're trying to get there, right? And so it's the usual suspects of the worst privacy companies in the world who are controlling AI, which is the future of productivity and maybe even the future of the web in some sense, right? And a lot of people have said, Proton shouldn't touch AI at all because it's bad for privacy. And I agree, it's bad for privacy like the web is bad for privacy, right? But I think it's a tragedy if we allow sort of the next decade to pass and allow the next revolution of let's say, the digital revolution that's happening for the past 30 years to be completely monopolized by players that we know don't give a shit about privacy and are there to basically ruin our lives online, right? And ruin democracy and freedom. Proton's not big, but what we're trying to do with Scribe is to have a seat at that table and to create an environment where the consumer doesn't have to make that hard choice between privacy and, productivity, and to build technology in a way that they can, credibly and potentially have both. And one of the things that, we did that was quite different here was doing local AI. So on Scribe, you can actually run it completely on your device, right? Nothing, gets sent to Proton. And that allows you to have data sovereignty while still being able to benefit from AI. We also did it, I think, quite differently. We don't train on your prompts. We don't have access to your data, so it's not using your data to do anything. It's not logging any prompts if you decide to send queries, to the server. And it's optional. We're not trying to shove AI down your throat. It's not even on by default. But if you want it, you can use it. And for now, it's limited just to business users. But actually, what's interesting is from the community, now that a lot of people on the consumer side are now asking, please, give us access to this as well. We also want to try. We also want to use it, right? So we'll have to make a decision about that to see what we do with it. But ultimately, as a company that is working for the community, what the community wants is what the community is going to get, right? So, we're listening to the input and we'll see how we go from there. But that's, I think, the explanation for why I think it's important for even companies like Proton to, do a bit with AI and to be involved there. Because in some ways, I think it's here, it's coming, whether we like it or not.
One of the great pleasures I've had in doing my interviews is interviewing hackers. And this is something that I started in more recent years after I started going to DEF CON. I managed to get an interview with Jeff Moss, who's the founder. I did that a couple times, actually. And through various connections, started finding people who were, part of the OG hacker groups, like the Cult of the Dead Cow. I interviewed Death Veggie and Omega last year, I think it was. And this year I managed to get somebody from the Loft. It was Chris Thomas. He had written a book about Loft Heavy Industries. That's L0PHT, as only hackers would spell it. And like all the hacker interviews, they've got amazing stories to tell and a very interesting perspective on things. And what I asked him here was, let's say you wanted to get into cybersecurity. Do you need a degree? Do you need certificates? How do you get started? And he had a very interesting answer. So here's a little clip from episode 398 on October 14th. What advice would you give to somebody who might be interested in entering the field of cybersecurity or ethical hacking? How important is a college degree? Because I think a lot of people think, oh, you need that for anything anymore. But this seems like one of those areas where you really don't. But that's another thing that a lot of people say, oh, you have to have certifications. You got to get these things that you could put on your resume. What advice would you give to somebody who wants to get into that? And if you have like books or websites or documentaries or anything else that you might want to throw out as like, go check this out, or text files. What would you recommend to somebody who's interested in getting into this field?
Let me start by talking about ethical hacking. You don't have ethical locksmiths. You don't have ethical lawyers, right? I really don't like this ethical hacking term. You're either a hacker or you're not. There's no anyway. As for people just starting out, that's interesting. The world has changed a lot. One of the things I do at IBM for X-Force is I help run our internship program. Not as much as I used to, but I started our own internship program at X-Force. And so we get a lot of resumes from people from around the country. We usually have like 10 slots. We get about 1,000 resumes for those 10 slots.
Wow.
And the quality of talent that is coming out of the schools today is absolutely amazing. And I look at some of the accomplishments these people put down in their resumes, and I'm like, holy moly, you're 22 years old, and you're already doing all this stuff. I'm like, wow. Which makes choosing interns really difficult. But I think 25 years ago, like when I started, you could not get an information security degree. It did not exist. Right. So that wasn't really a choice. Today, it's an easy choice. A lot of schools offer information security, and it's easy to get. It's not necessarily easy, but you can get a degree, if you put your mind to it. That said, degrees cost money, and formalized education is not for everyone, myself included. I strongly encourage everyone to get a degree if they can. It makes your life a whole lot easier. You overcome a lot of hurdles instantly with that piece of paper. But if you can't, or for whatever reason, certifications is a great way to go too. What certifications to get, that depends on where you want to be and what kind of job you want to get and what company you want to work for. Some companies require certifications. Some companies will allow you to get the certification after you get the job and will pay for it. Varies by company. But how do you get started, right? If you can't go to school or can't get into the school and you can't afford the certifications or whatnot, there are a lot of free activities on the web. Hack in the Box is one. There are CTFs, a lot of free CTFs out there. Pico CTF comes to mind. You can volunteer at a local B-Sides conference. Yep. You will learn so much about security, not to mention people that are in security, by going to a B-Sides conference. And there's pretty much one in every city these days.
Yeah.
Within a couple hours drive at least. And they're, for the most part, free or low cost to attend. Obviously, that's a great way to start. Books and self-learning, if that's your thing, great. There's a lot of self-paced learning online as well. So there are ways to get started. But I hate to say it, but I think these days you really got to get the degree. If you can't get the security degree, get an easier degree. Get one in English literature. having that piece of paper checks the box on so many things and makes life a lot easier. Can you go a different route? Absolutely. Can you achieve the same things a different way? Absolutely. Is it a whole lot harder? Yes, it is.
Like, I think it was the White House or CISA or somebody just recently put out a thing basically saying that we don't necessarily require college degrees anymore, which I thought was huge. And I thought that was because so much of this stuff, if you're motivated enough, especially all you need is a computer and yourself and the internet probably. And there's so much you can learn on your own. I think it was kind of neat that they kind of acknowledge, you know what, you don't have to have a college degree. And maybe I hope that kind of spreads to the industry, because this seems like an area where a lot of people don't have to. And I completely agree with what you're saying. And I wanted my daughters to get college degrees no matter what they did, because it's a ticket.
Yeah, I mean, IBM actually is the same way. We don't require college degrees, but if you're looking at the hiring manager and he gets 100,000 resumes for 10 slots, and he's comparing somebody with a degree versus somebody without, the person without has got to have a lot of other experience and other stuff to make up for not having that degree. And that's the personal individual bias of the person reviewing the job, that the applicants. So, while some of these places may not require a degree to get hired, you're doing yourself a disservice if you don't try. Here's my own personal story. I didn't get a college degree until I was like 35. And basically, I went to a bunch of job interviews, and these were standard tech IT help desk jobs. And I would get all the way to the final interview where you're pretty sure they're going to offer you the job. And they're like, I don't see a degree on your resume. And I'm like, well, no, because I have 15 years experience. I've been doing this since, whenever. And I've done this and I've done that and I've done this. It's all there on the resume. And they're like, oh, thank you very much. We'll let you know. And you never hear from them again. So after like the fourth or fifth time of that, and I finally got a job, I was like, all right, I got to go get a degree. So I spent one class a semester. It took me 8 years. I tested out of classes. Basically, we just went to my local college, some online, some in person. But I now have a Bachelor of IT degree from University of Massachusetts Lowell. But I didn't graduate until I was in my late 30s. So anyway, it can be done. It can be done cheaply. Got to do it.
All right, I had to include one from the 400th episode. And yes, 400 episodes. I've been doing this for almost 8 years now. Every week, without fail, 400 weeks in a row. This is a pretty amazing thing. And at the 100th episode, I'd been bugging Bruce Schneier to come on the show for quite a while. And I finally played the 100th episode card. My Pod Centennial, I called it. And I said, if you're ever going to come on, Bruce, this is the time. And he said, okay, let's do it. And somehow along the way, I managed to convince him to come back for every 100th episode. And, he probably figured, yeah, okay, sure. Not likely to happen. I'll come back. Well, it happened multiple times, as it turns out. And he's on board to come back for every 100. So I'm very happy about that. AI was a big topic all year long. It's been in the news quite a bit, and there's a lot of security and privacy implications. But Bruce, as always, had a very unique take on AI, and he had some really positive ideas about how AI could be very transformational in our lives beyond just the usual, techie stuff. So here's a little snippet of my interview with Bruce Schneier on the 400th episode, which aired just before Halloween on October 28th. Talk a little bit about some of the essays you've written, Lisa, about how AI could disrupt our democracy, and what there are some other concerning ways that it might influence law enforcement, politics, lawmaking. This sounded almost like your next book, actually.
So it is my next book, but the difference is that I'm more optimistic than pessimistic.
Okay.
You use the word disrupt. I use the word affect. And there's good and bad. And we can talk about misinformation and fake news. Everyone talks about that. I don't think that's very interesting, actually. I think there's a lot of places where AI can make a huge difference in democracy for the better, if we let it. And we might not, right? It might be like, another case of we can't have nice things. So you're right about AI being potentially transformational. And I think of AI changing things across 4 dimensions. I'm going to say it right. Speed, scale, scope, and sophistication. Right? So, the problem with AI's trading stocks is not that they're better at it, just that they're faster at it. Right? High-speed trading is the thing, and high-speed trading has changed the nature of trading. Right? The difference in speed made something completely different. And similarly, AI's playing Go has changed the nature of the game. Humans are learning new strategy from computers.
Yeah.
So what I'm writing about, what I'm thinking about, is how AI will change democracy across 5 different dimensions. I think about politics. I think about legislating, bureaucracy, the legal system, and finally citizen engagement. So those 5 areas.
Okay.
And in all of them, I see both risks and promises. It's not all bad. It's not all good. So, AI as assistive tech is great. AIs can help write laws. AIs can help write laws that are more complete, that have fewer loopholes. We lost the Chevron deference in the United States, so Congress is going to be required to write much more complex law.
Mm-hmm.
AI can help with that. And there's a lot of promise here. And it's not going to be AIs are now legislating. AIs will become legislative assistants, just like humans are. I mean, when a congressperson introduces a bill, they didn't write it, right? Somebody else wrote it.
Yeah. For lucky, it was a staffer. For not lucky, it was a lobbyist.
Well, right. Well, lucky, but it was a human.
Yeah.
You can imagine the human turning to an AI and saying, write me a bill on this. Make sure it doesn't intersect with these things. The one example I know, and this is last year, Brazil, Puerto Alegre is the city, has the first law written entirely by AI. It was about water meters, so nothing exciting here. Although, water meters matter.
Seems like a safe place to start.
And the human legislator wanted a bill, turned to a chatbot, and gave it a prompt. It produced a bill. The human legislator looked at it and said, "Yeah, that looks good." Submitted it into the legislature. The different legislators debated and voted. I don't know what they do in Puerto Alegre, Brazil. Presumably, they have their process.
Yeah,
and it passed, unchanged.
Huh.
And then he said, "Hey, look, the AI wrote this." But that's exactly what we want. Right? The AI does the drudgery work of writing the thing. The humans review it. The humans discuss it. The humans debate it. The humans vote on it. And it becomes law. That's great. And if that makes people better legislators, I'm all for it. Take another example. We can imagine AIs adjudicating disputes. So not in a courtroom, although there's a lot of uses of AI in courtrooms, and I think we can think about those. But you can certainly imagine, just as 2 people enter into binding arbitration agreements, right? If you get into a contract with somebody, there might be a clause saying you agree to binding arbitration. Basically, what that means is we agree that if we disagree, we're not going to sue each other because that's expensive. We're going to go to this, private arbitrator, which is a lot cheaper, and get our dispute resolved.
Right.
You can imagine 2 people saying, tomorrow, we're going to just use the AI. Right? We're going to, it's even cheaper than the service. we just ask the AI gives us a ruling. And that's going to change the nature of disputes. And that's interesting. You can imagine doing it 5 times a day.
So what about as citizens? Do you foresee us as citizens using AI as tools? Like I could see using it to help me interpret law. Let's say I've been charged with something. And yes, I'll have a lawyer, but it would also be nice if I could have an AI that would kind of run through the laws and kind of dumb them down for me so I understand what they mean.
And this is AI. I think there's a lot of promise here. So yes, AI as explainer is a really powerful use case, whether it's explaining, particle physics to you, or explaining it to you saying a certain law, or explaining the nuances of a bill or an election or something that you might want to support or not support. I think there's a lot of power here in educating and explaining, and there, of course, are people going to use it? I can't solve the people don't care problem, but I can solve the we don't have enough explainers. And a lot of the use cases, it's not AI versus human, it's AI versus nobody, because we don't have enough humans. I'd rather have an AI-assisted public defender than an overworked, not very good human public defender, right? If that's my choice. That might not be my choice, right? I might get stuck with a bad AI or a bad human, in which case, I think there's a lot of value in AIs helping us navigate bureaucracy.
Yeah.
Here again, if you are wealthy, you can hire someone to help you through immigration court or housing court, or so any of those things where having advocate matters. If an AI can give that advocacy to more people, that's great. It'd be even better to give every one of those people a human advocate, but that isn't an option.
As we love to say on this show, the S in IoT is for security, which is to say that there is none. And I also like to say that the P in IoT is for privacy, along the same vein. Well, I got to talk to a IoT guru, somebody that I've heard on the Twit network for many years, named Stacey Higginbotham. She's a lot of fun to talk to. We had a really great episode on IoT, which is when some part of your smart internet-connected device, some part of its core functionality is tied to a cloud service. So what happens, for example, when the cloud service is down? Or more to the point, what happens when that company goes out of business? Does your device continue to work? Well, Stacey and the group that she's working with had an interesting idea about how the government might require companies to plan for that eventuality. Here's a little snippet from episode 402. All right, so one other idea that is often bandied about when we're talking about this, I've heard it many times, I've proposed this myself, is that companies should be required to escrow their software code and maybe even like their hardware designs, so that if they go out of business or the devices are no longer supported for whatever reason, that at that point, these things, the secret sauce, these things become public, which theoretically at least would allow third parties to come in and then take over and continue writing software that might support these things. But you guys put out something, another escrow idea that I hadn't really heard about, I don't think, before, that I think was very interesting. Explain that to us.
Yeah. So the idea is, like I said, it costs money to keep a connected device operational. And our idea isn't that you put the code in escrow, because that's very popular with the engineering world. But most consumers, once you tell them, find an SD card, go to this website, load this, then flash it, you have lost the consumer at find the SD card, right? And so that's why I think, as nice as it is, like escrowing code doesn't help. But escrowing money helps. And if you are using like the generally accepted accounting principle or principles that say, oh, it's cost me X dollars a day to support this device, then you know how much it's going to cost to support the number of devices you've sold for as long as you've said you're going to support them. And that's how much money you should put in escrow. And we've actually seen companies like allocate both parts and engineering time to support connected products into a certain 5-year future, right? So Neato, a company that made a robot vacuum cleaner, their parent company shut it down. But as part of shutting it down, they said, we are creating a parts inventory for 5 years, and we are allocating a set amount of engineering time to support the continued software updates up to whatever date. And that's the sort of thing, like if you plan ahead for failure, like we say, then you can actually allocate the resources needed to support something for consumers for a reasonable amount of time after the product
That's
fails.
amazing. Were they required to do this by law, or there's some altruistic?
They're German. They also had other businesses.
Okay.
I mean, I used to tell companies this all the way back in like 2013. I was like, hey, what's your plan if you go out of business? And they would be like, Stacey, we're not going to go out of business. And I can tell you, I mean, the math says that only like 2 or 3 out of 10 companies are going to be successful. So they did go out of business.
All right. Last but absolutely not least was an interview I just did a couple months ago with Carissa Valise, who's the author of the amazing book, Privacy is Power. And I've been wanting to interview Carissa since the book, actually since before the book came out. I had seen it advertised as coming soon, this book, and the description immediately told me that I had to read it. And I reached out to her before it even came out in the U.S. to try to get her on the show. And it, for various reasons, it didn't happen until just recently. And obviously, if you're a current listener, you caught this one. But this interview, and I need to go back and count it. It's 400 episodes, and maybe half of those are interviews. So let's say I've done 200 interviews. This is absolutely in my top 5. So I absolutely had to include a clip of this. And here I ask kind of a deep question about whether or not, if we are in danger of the younger population not ever knowing a world like we, older people like myself and maybe you, where we used to have privacy. Is it possible that if we don't fix this soon, then the generations who are making the decisions and voting and are in power will be ones that don't even know what it was like in the before times? So here's a little snippet from a fantastic interview, episode 404. Many big tech CEOs over the years have famously uttered some version of privacy is dead, get over it. I think one actually said something very close to that, but the rest of them have implied over the years in public statements that, this is a new world and privacy is, as you knew it, is gone. And that's a good thing. Are we in danger of normalizing mass surveillance? Maybe this is a little bit over the top, but I'm kind of worried about the younger generations who have only known a world with social media and ubiquitous tracking. Like, what happens when no one alive remembers what it was like to have real privacy?
I worry about that too. And it's essentially an experiment because we don't know. We haven't had that world before. And part of the experiment is, again, going to that very fundamental question: how much surveillance can democracy take? And we're really testing those limits. So there are good news and bad news. The good news is that we still have a lot of privacy, and people have been saying that privacy is dead for pretty much centuries. And we have a lot of privacy first because it's still the case that most of our life is analog. Even if you're always online, even if you have your phone on you, most of your conversations are still analog. And interestingly, most of what people buy, they still buy face-to-face. Now, the bad news is that we have definitely increased dramatically the amount of personal data that we're collecting, and that trend is not stopping and it's not slowing down. So we definitely have a lot less privacy than we had 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. And what you say about young people is particularly concerning because it's very hard, I think, for most young people who have grown up under surveillance to even imagine what it's like not to be surveilled and why it's important.
Right.
I think sometimes when we lose very valuable things, it's possible to not even notice what we lose, even when we experience them, much less when we've never experienced it. So I had an experience not too long ago. Somebody invited me to give a talk. And when I got there to give a talk, there was a camera and a microphone. And I said, I'm really sorry, but this wasn't part of the deal. You never told me that I was going to be recorded. And so the organizer frantically looked through the emails. And in fact, I had never been asked whether it was okay to record it. So he turned the video off, but wasn't happy about it at all. And then we had a great session, very interactive. And he very kindly and a bit sheepishly came up to me after the talk and said, "This is probably the best session we've had, and I wonder if it was because the cameras were off." And wow. he was somebody who had experienced the world before cameras, but maybe their students had never had a class that hadn't been recorded.
Wow, that's really interesting. I've heard anecdotal stories of kids today, and I've got two daughters that are just out of college, but I think even they're maybe older than where some of this is coming from. Younger kids actually shunning like technology and actually trying to get some of their life back. And I don't know if that's a real trend or not. Have you seen anything like that? Has there been any sort of techlash? Has there been any sort of taking back your privacy notion? Maybe it's not a privacy thing. Maybe it's just a shunning of social media. But do you foresee a time when we might actually push back against this for one reason or another?
It's up to us. I think it's too speculative to try to predict the future. And I don't like it because if I say yes or no, I seem to give the impression that the die has been cast. And it hasn't. It depends on us. So it depends on what we want. But in history, we definitely see a trend that when authoritarianism rises, there tends to be a backlash. However, once you have this much surveillance, it becomes harder and harder to defy power. Because I remember having a lot of conversations with Spaniards about the time of Franco and their methods to communicate, to resist, to challenge, to hide. And while they were telling me their stories, I was thinking none of this would work today. And so we are making it a lot harder to defy authoritarian tendencies. But going back to young people, yes, there are some interesting stories about young people trying to get back some of their data and get back some of their analog life. And one example that I cite in Privacy is Power is the example of a group of young people who share an account and live in different places around the world, and they all use the same account. And so for the people tracking them, it's harder to know who is who and where do they live and what are their patterns. And in general, with my own students, I'm seeing a lot of it. But I wonder how representative my students are. I teach at Oxford. Right. These are people who are studying philosophy and computer science. So potentially not the most representative part of the population. But sometimes I'm shocked that I ask young people what social media they use and they say nothing. And I'm like, okay, so what shows do you watch? No shows. And I'm like, what do you do? Because they don't read either. So some of them are... It's very strange, very different lifestyles. Some of them, they tell me, play role games. Some of them do sewing. It's really? It's an interesting crowd.
All right, I hope you enjoyed that. A little trip down memory lane for 2024. Again, if you like this, please share it with others. Help me, and you can help me reach some more people. Also, if you know a quote-unquote influencer, or somebody works at a NPR or PBS or maybe AARP or other places that have a big social media following and perhaps might want to interview me, you could share this with them too. For my top-tier patrons this week, I'll have my Merlin's Musings. It'll be part 2 on the secret life of metadata. That's been a lot of fun. And for the regular podcast next week, I'm going to pull up a classic interview from way back in the early days of this show. It's been almost 8 years now, so there's quite likely some interviews from back then that you have never heard. So I went back and picked one that I think will hold up today and that I thought was one of my best interviews. Now, after that, I'm going to do another best of episode, but that one will be the best of the bonus content. So every week when I'm saying, and my patrons are going to hear this bonus clip on Thursday, most of you don't hear that because most of you are not patrons. Well, this is your chance to get a sampling of what that's like, and I'll give you a little taste by putting together some of my favorite clips from the bonus podcast stuff, normally only heard by patrons, and that will be the episode after that. And then we'll be into 2025 and back to our normal schedule. So one quick reminder, I actually had somebody respond to my awareness campaign and said, I've been listening to your show for 6 months and I had no idea you had a book until now. I'm horrible at marketing. I'm not good at this stuff. So just real quick, if you don't know, I do have a book called Firewalls Don't Stop Dragons. It's actually what started all of this. It's over 600 pages long now. It's got over 200 tips for how to protect your privacy and security. Go to my website and you can learn all about it. So that's going to do it this week. Take care, everybody. Stay safe out there. Have a happy holiday season. And until next time, as always, don't get caught with your drawbridge stuff.